Okay, great. So, hi, everybody who's watching. My name is Adam Capitanio. I am the Director of Programs at Humanities New York. And I am joined today by Jasmine Syedullah, who's a professor at Vassar College. And our topic for our conversation today is cultural culture, rather. Jasmine Syedullah is a theorist of abolitionist movement scholarship, as well as the co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation, which was published by North Atlantic Books in 2016. She joined the faculty of Vassar College in 2019 and holds the Africana Studies program's first assistant professor line there. Curating creative collaborations of activist knowledge is an academic research. Syedullah blends political theory, Black feminism, and contemplative approaches to critical prison studies to consider how transgenerational relays of political representation and retreat from US cultural cultures shape the political time of underground abolitionist thought and practice. Her current book project reckons with the means and meanings of abolition that live on through the works and witnesses of Miss Harriet Jacobs' 1861 slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. With Jacobs, Syedullah theorizes a Black feminist politics of time rooted in retreats from colonial geographies of reason, recognition, and mastery towards what Jacobs calls something, quote, akin to freedom. Her research is published in Palimpsest, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International, Abolition, a journal of insurgent politics, the Journal of Contemporary Political Theory, Society and Space, Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, and Truth Out. And it is my pleasure to welcome Jasmine with us today. Just to sort of get started, I think, we might start with like the personal before we move out to the, the social or the cultural. And so I thought I might ask, what led you to think about incarceration and to sort of center it in the sort of work that you do?
Thanks so much for that entry, personal as political, Adam. It's really great to be with you all today, and thank you for the lovely introduction. I have been like meditating, marinating on the problems that I've seen that come out of incarceration since I was first entering into a prison space. I think before then, in college, I volunteered for an organization on campus that it was called Space for Women in Prison. It's an acronym, Space in Prison for the creative expression, arts and the creative expression. And before then, prison and incarceration seemed like something that was very far away. I had family members who had been incarcerated my whole life whom I'd never met, except for like a fuzzy animal that I had, or, I knew of trials that were happening and the consequences of those trials being incarceration, but I'd never seen what happens when you walk inside. Even as a quote unquote free person, the actual visceral experience of being inside a medium security prison outside Providence, Rhode Island was incredibly illuminating in ways that I could not have possibly anticipated. And, I was young, I was 20 years old, and a lot of the women that I was meeting were my age or younger. A lot of the women that I met inside had kids that were my age that they weren't able to see, or younger. And what we did in that space was write poetry. So we were just storytelling, testimony, sharing. And in that story exchange, in that creative catalyst, there were nothing but mirrors in that space. And so I was able to really see how much the impacts of the war on drugs and the war on poverty were creating separations between me and the folks that were inside in ways that I didn't have to think about at all once I left if I didn't want to. And yet, present realities always, particularly for the folks that I was visiting. I was in intake wing. So not with folks who are there for a very long time, but with folks whose lives had been incredibly deeply and abruptly interrupted by being in a holding pattern, either waiting trial or serving out short sentences, and just even being able to experience the that impact of being separated from loved ones, separated from support, separated from home, and having to make home in a new place, in a place that's hostile, in a place that's sterile, in a place that's incredibly punitive. Woke up for me what privilege actually is, right? Like the ability to walk out of a place like that instead of having to be there in order to serve time. It was incredibly eye-opening experience. And I think that piece about storytelling was the most generative for me. The fact that we were there to exchange stories and learn from each other kind of created a whole pattern of relationship building that would carry me through to today. So I've always been led by the stories and witness and testimony of incarcerated people. Their embodied experience of incarceration to me is the most valuable teaching tools that we have in our society, particularly because prisons and jails tend to be places that are so far removed from society that folks who are not visiting or working in them are not necessarily aware of how it feels to be inside, outside of, the spectacle of television or film.
Right.
And all of those are quite glamorized. And so being able to feel how it feels in your own body to walk in and have to release all of your possessions, and even in order to even enter, becomes a teaching moment in and of itself.
Yeah, thanks for that. A couple things really struck me in what you just said, like the notion of, you know, prison, even when you're sort of in the holding, kind of awaiting trial or sentencing or something like that, is a sort of complete interruption in, your life, in the life that you would like to be leading or would otherwise maybe be leading. And also the notion too that it felt so visceral, even just in a medium security prison. We usually think of like the kind of the sort of bad prison being like maximum security, right? And the fact that you could go into this space and have that kind of visceral response, even in a prison that's supposed to be like less bad, is really kind of it's telling and it's eye opening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That kind of aspect of like what is that visceral feeling, right? I just want to break it down a little bit, because
Sure.
as I, delved into this field of both activism and research and community building, what I began to experience is that visceral feeling wasn't limited to being in a brick and mortar prison.
Mm.
I got to see kind of its concentric circles, kind of the ripple out effect of that experience in spaces just, of incidental interaction with the criminal quote unquote justice system, right? Pulled over by the cops, having to go to jury duty, like being someone who is working in highly policed neighborhoods, working with youth who are coming out of the foster system and are living in group homes, and just experiencing how much surveillance people are under, and how much consequence comes with stepping out of line when you're under someone else's watch in that way, right? So we all know how it feels to be constantly under surveillance, unfortunately.
Right.
But one of the things that kind of come with that in kind of this society of cameras everywhere and social media and everyone taking pictures of everyone else constantly, you can't even go on vacation without
Right.
surveillance being part of the experience. And we participate in it willingly, but the idea that there is, a reward for that, largely, career boosting, networking, as opposed to every move you make could be a further criminalization, a further increase of time, a further increase of the degree of torture that someone is experiencing, that kind of, if you just imagine all of the kind of incentivized relationships to surveillance we have in our popular culture, and then show the shadow of that in prison industrial complex, in carceral culture, you really start to see how that surveillance has a different vibration.
Yeah.
Depending on you're in and what neighborhood you're in, what space you're occupying.
Yeah, I really love that idea of this sort of the kind of the carceral culture being the sort of shadow of the sort of everyday surveillance that we experience just walking down the street, passing through other people's, smartphone videos or phones. Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Um, I wonder if actually we could just zoom out for a moment and think about and maybe sort of define some of these terms that we're talking a little bit about, things like carceral culture, or you hear people talk a lot about mass incarceration. That's been a sort of a term that's been used quite a bit in the last decade or so. Even things like carceral capitalism you hear sometimes. And I think it might be worth maybe defining some of those terms, what it is that we mean by those when we're talking about them.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking for those questions, because I think, yeah, we can use these terms interchangeably
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily understand the kind of weight that they carry. That's quite distinct.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about this word carceral is particularly confounding, I think, because it's a newer part of the language that's coming out of both activism and scholarship around prison reform and prison abolition specifically. So people who have been invested in thinking about alternatives to prison have really focused in on not just thinking about prisons as the problem specifically or exclusively, but thinking about the prison industrial complex, thinking about the corporate interests that are involved, the private and public interests that have kind of concentric circles of investment in prisons keeping us safe. So this idea that prisons keep us safe is one of the kind of prevailing ideologies of our modern society, right? We really rely on it in terms of how we pick schools, how we pick homes, where we choose to invest our recreational time, where we choose to travel, right? It actually shapes quite a bit of our movement, even if it's quite removed from our immediate consciousness. So I like to think about the prison industrial complex kind of as the first term, because it's the one that entered our kind of popular culture first.
Mm-hmm.
And that really gets us thinking about the prison as bigger than just the brick and mortar situation. But the carceral gets us thinking more about, like, what is our reliance on incarceration, not just prisons as a place and a
Mm-hmm.
technology as a policy priority for keeping us safe in society that we rely on, but what about the ideology of incarceration as an effective tool for society itself, right? What
Right.
does it mean to think about our reliance on punishment as a form of advancing and protecting our freedoms, our ideals of justice, the idea of balance in society, accountability for wrong and violence, deterrence from those kinds of things too? That brings us into a much larger set of ideas and values that we cherish in our society. And those are the things that I really like to think about, because then it's more than just corporate interests, private interests, policy and politics, right? Economics and society. Now we're thinking about values, philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
ethics, ideology, right? What are the kind of aesthetics of justice that make us feel most at home, right? Like, walk into a place that's new, does having a militarized armed guard at the front of that space make us feel safe or make us feel more trepidatious,
Right.
right? beginning to kind of unpack the layers of that really helps us to start to see that safety, everyday, ordinary protections of safety, expectations of safety, are complicated,
Right.
really complicated. And the kinds of technologies that we have in society to protect us are largely incredibly visible, right? The police, the prisons, even if they're far away from our everyday consciousness, we know that they exist, and we interact with them to varying degrees depending on our proximity to criminalization. But the reality is that violence and harm in our society is largely invisible, right? We don't talk about intimate partner violence. We don't talk about domestic violence as much as we need to. We don't talk about the kinds of violence that actually land people in prison. Like most of the people who end up in prison for violent crimes are engaged in some kind of intimate dispute, right? And so being able to kind of just sharpen our gaze in terms of what we think of when we think of danger in society, and kind of move away from the CIS Miami, the Law and Order kind of spectacles, right? And we are able, once we're able to kind of unpack those spectacles, what do we see? We see poverty, we see houselessness, we see people living without access to healthcare and means of being able to feed themselves and protect their families. And what we see is a lot of economic and social instability just in terms of people's basic needs. And when that proliferates over years, over generations, across time and space, there's going to be a lot of insecurity and volatility in the society. And incarceration, our reliance on carceral culture, is the quick fix to structural injustice, structural inequalities, structural inability to access the same kind of resources and entitlements, protections, and safety and comfort. This is what happens in society, is that we, instead of having kind of robust, kind of collaborative mutual aid solutions to complex systemic problems, what we rely on is carceral culture to kind of fill in the gaps of our imagination of what to do in instances of harm and violence, particularly when I'm thinking about these things in the ways that intimate harm and intimate violence are only fixed in the after, in the wake, in the aftermath of them. And one of the things that we've been really focused on as we think about solutions to the harm that prisons and policing create in our society is, how do we get to the root causes of harm and violence? And a lot of the focus is on prison reform and prison abolition even, skip over how come this harm is happening in the first place? How come this violence is happening in the first place? And the answers to those questions are rabbit hole, like, oh, they are endless holes, right? And so being able to kind of unpack the reliance on carceral culture, we begin to see all kinds of incredibly complex, intricate social networks of problems that require incredibly robust, skillful expertise, right? Collaborations of expertise to begin to imagine differently. And so thinking about carceral culture just helps us open up the lens of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about prisons to include our everyday ordinary culture. You know, how come we rely on cancel culture, right? Instead of actually having the skills and tools for talking through transforming harm into repair. We'd much rather just cut people out and cut them off than include both perpetrators of violence and survivors of violence in a collaborative process of being able to look at the culture of harm that everyone has been impacted in and impacted by, implicated in and impacted by, in order to move differently, in order to not just punish harm and not just end violence, but understand why it happened in the first place, and really think about how we get at the root causes and shift them from the ground up.
Yeah, that's my kind of next question to you was going to be, which you've talked a little bit about already, is about how this sort of carceral culture, impacts our everyday experience, especially, or even maybe those of us who are kind of far removed from incarceration, conceptualized as a brick and mortar place where we kind of put people. I think that the example you just had of kind of cancel culture, I think, is a one maybe that resonates with the contemporary sort of political imagination. This notion that someone who has, it's a carceral mindset, in other words, someone who has done something or said something wrong just kind of gets removed and put into another place so that we don't have to think about them anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
That is like that disposability.
Right.
That's so connected to the concept that you were talking about earlier, the carceral capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
right? So once we start to understand, oh, our reliance on prisons and policing isn't just interpersonal or just systemic, it's cultural, it's in the water, it's part of kind of the air we breathe, then we start to see how it mingles with the other things, the other toxins in the air, right? Like colonialism, like
Mm-hmm.
capitalism, environmental degradation, right? How does our relationship to the earth inform our relationship to safety? Right, we start to be able to kind of make these larger connections. And this relationship to wastefulness is a
Mm-hmm.
huge one. Like the fact that we are just so oriented towards convenience over conservation is an incredibly clarifying mirror for us in our culture, because it doesn't just impact our relationship, of course, to the environment. It also, which is foundational, right? Our relationship to the earth isn't foundational, but it also impacts our relationships to each other. So if we don't have a kind of conservational relationship to the place in which we live, the nature and resources that we rely on for future generations, then you better believe we're not going to have a conservative or conservationist, relationship to one another. Right.
Right.
So that kind of objectification of nature becomes an objectification of each other. And when we are able to objectify each other, it becomes much easier to step over a body or ignore a body that's suffering in the street, right? It's possible to disengage with the humanity of a person who's been locked up because they've had lack of opportunity or have made a mistake or have just been in a really bad place and the police were around for it, right? So
Right.
there are so many people who have been impacted and make bad decisions because of our relationship to kind of disposability culture, but not everyone is incarcerated for it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
being able to understand the kind of disproportionate impact of disposability politics in our culture really starts to kind of elevate our consciousness around race and gender, around kind of citizenship status, around class and poverty. And we really start to see the patterns very clearly. There are so many resources for thinking about how the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration in particular, this kind of boom of reliance on prisons to keep us safe that really happened as the economic solidity of our social system was shifting, right? So in the 70s, as we went from this kind of much more stable relationship to the dollar, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like in earlier to the gold standard, as we start to move into a much more fluid relationship to economic value, we also move into a much more fluid relationship to human life and value, right? And so we end up seeing these warehouses really moving into our landscape, these prison warehouses where incredible amounts of people who are vulnerable to unemployment and poverty and criminalization are being housed. Now, why are they being housed there? Those relationships to mass incarceration that disproportionately impact Black men, Latinx men, trans women, right? Queer and LGBTQ communities, people of color, immigrants, folks who have suffered violence and haven't had an ability to heal. All of these folks, what do they have in common? This is really what I start to think about, because I think with my students, really the furthest we get is being able to say, oh, this is a problem with race and class. It's a problem of disproportionality. But once you start to focus on this disposability thread that runs through both the environment, the economics, and our society, we start to see something else happening here, right? You would only warehouse people if you thought that it's almost the same as quarantining. Like quarantine, what kind of threat do these folks pose to the quote unquote general population? Right? It's not just about crime. It's actually about economics. And so being able to understand the kind of social hierarchies that are held in place by keeping large portions of the population outside of the workforce, outside of accessibility to social welfare and public services, even public parks and places for recreation. This is a way of controlling the population and allowing privilege to be protected, right? So what we really see is this kind of intimacy that's being invisibilized, right? The violence that's being invisibilized in the everyday culture is also a space of there's like, I'm still trying to kind of work through how to teach the interconnections, but what I want to be able to just help people think about today is this idea that the intimate spaces of our everyday lives that we think of as non-political, right? Just the ability to have your own space, your own home, your own place to convene people and be in community, to gather without concern, is connected to carceral culture, right? Because the institutions that are in effect to protect those spaces, to be peaceful and comfortable and reliable, are the same forces that are infringing upon that possibility for others, right? And so intimate space has been a real focus for me as I've gone from this kind of large systemic analysis of a political system of oppression and its history to being able to see its effects on our everyday lives and how we would change them. Because oftentimes when we think about systemic change, racism, sexism, we think about large federal policy, we think about constitutional amendment. And while those things are absolutely necessary, as we know, they can be rolled back and they're insufficient to actually changing the culture, right? And so being able to attend to not just the systemic impacts, right? But the embodied awareness and consciousness and how we change that from the inside out, to me, is part of the equation of understanding the impact. So it's not just about the personal being political, although that feminist adage is incredibly helpful at this juncture in this conversation. It's also that the personal is a choice, right? And that we've been habituated through our culture to desire particular kinds of comforts, desire particular aesthetics of safety, not really understanding what their material implications are for all of those who share in this society with us, right? So because we have such a focus on our individual freedom, we've been kind of blinded to the ways in which our individual freedoms, I'll say, are intimately, interdependently networked to everyone else's. And COVID was the big teacher, I think, of this, right? And so being able to see the impacts of my privacy, my rights, my safety coming at the consequence of others' dispossession of those has been a huge teacher, all the way from me going into this women's prison as a 20-year-old,
Right.
to working with trans incarcerated communities now, working with communities who are highly policed, and working in spaces that are being gentrified and increasingly criminalized in kind of the spirit of urban renewal and development, right? But having negative impacts and dispossessions of the rights, protections, and comforts of the people who are already there, right? So being able to understand the interdependence of our safety, freedom, and comfort is a much bigger conversation than one that just talks about the wrongs of policing and prisons. It actually calls us all in to think about our interdependence and interrelationship to each other, and how the way I keep myself safe puts others in danger.
Yeah. You started to talk to this a little bit when you mentioned in the sort of the 1970s, that moment when the American economy, at least, became sort of financialized, and went through the period of deindustrialization, which led to this kind of large population of people who might otherwise have been working productive jobs or something like that. It now required a sort of space or place to sort of put all these people in some respect. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit more about how follow that train of thought and talk a little bit more about how we got to this current place that we've been talking about, this sort of carceral culture. What maybe is the history that got us there, or even just maybe sort of particular historical moments like that moment in the 1970s that maybe produced the situation that we find ourselves in now.
This is one of my favorite questions, and I'm still, putting the pieces together, because in a large sense, there's multiple narratives, right? So there's multiple stories about that tell this. There's multiple narratives that tell the story about the history of our reliance on prisons to keep us safe. There's the story of capital and deindustrialization, as you were talking about, and the kind of rise of capitalism in the kind of progressive era in the early part of the 20th century. And this is really when a lot of prisons were built, right? In the kind of aftermath of the Civil War, in the wake of Reconstruction, the relationship between many of the binaries that we work with today are constructions of this 20th century moment, right? Thinking about perpetrator and victim in this kind of standard way has been here for a long, long time. But being able to think about kind of these patterns of incarceration as racialized, as targeting poor people who have less access to jobs, education, this starts to open up a different kind of analysis of why we put people behind bars, right? So one of the things I like to think about and really center in my understanding of the story of the construction of prisons in our country is not just the economic, but the theological.
Okay.
Right. So not just the kind of economic drivers for population control, but also this kind of, going back to Max Weber and the Protestant work ethic, going back to these ideas of who is deserving of salvation, right? And who needs to be punished and suffer. A lot of that obviously is related to economics, but it's also related to kind of an idea of moral fortitude and a kind of idea of, respectability.
Right.
And so there are people who are seen as not only economically deserving, but morally sound because of their economic status. And what we start to see through the end of the kind of 1900s, the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s is this shift where your legibility as a problem, like what makes you a problem, isn't just your lack of a job, but it's also your undesirability, your lack of respectability in terms of race and gender, right? So as the institutions that were kind of keeping the social hierarchies of society in place dissolved, slavery, the franchise, and then in the earlier part of the 20th century, the inclusion of women into the ability to vote, all of these infrastructures of society disappearing actually made it important to have something else emerge that could continue to segregate and stratify society in ways that were a bit more subtle, right? And so one of the things that has been really fascinating to me is to really meditate on the 13th Amendment and what it says, right? So we all celebrate the 13th Amendment as the end of slavery, right? As we all know, there's a provision in it which says, except as punishment for crime, right? And in that proviso, what really happens is that we preserve slavery as a form of carceral punishment, right? So it lives on in the form of the criminal justice system. And now it's no longer seen as kind of an aberration, it's actually seen as the solution. And so being able to see how we go from the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery to convict leasing and debt peonage, to later in the 20th century mass incarceration is really a story about seeing the punitive apparatus of the state shift its technological focus from those who are merely obstructing people's rights to private property, right? Or either to themselves, like to the sovereignty of their physical selves, or the relationship that they have to their homes and goods, to vagrancy laws, right? To the punishment of women for not having appropriate clothing, right? So now we're starting to police and criminalize not just kind of violations, transgressions of civil society and respectability that have to do with property ownership. They also have to do with custom, right? So we're policing gender norms. We're policing citizenship, what it means to be a citizen. And if you're seen as a threat to the even meaning of citizenship, your privacy, your personhood can be threatened by the state. And so you also see in that late kind of 1800s, early 1900s period of time, the rise of the Klan and vigilante violence. And these kinds of kind of social forces, kind of de facto social forces, become legitimized over time because they're being enacted by people who wear two hats, who are both citizens and state actors, you know, police officers, but not in the garb of the police, but in the garb of white sheets, right? And being able to see how that kind of vigilante violence creates increased amounts of terror for folks who are just enjoying their lives, really starts to chart a different relationship to what it means to feel at home in the places we call home, particularly for formerly enslaved populations living in the South, right, leading to the Great Migration. And so you can start to see how incarceration is embedded and embedded into the emergence of the kind of racial consciousness that we have now, the emergence of the kind of racial and gender disparities that we have represented in prisons today, right? The kind of attacks on women and LGBTQ communities that happen not necessarily all through predation, though that happens too, but also through neglect, right? Not being able to protect those who have been attacked by vigilante violence has its history in the rise of the Klan in the late 1800s. Being able to see the kind of inability of the law to protect survivors of domestic violence when they defend themselves, we see iterations of that going all the way back into the time of slavery, when it was impossible for enslaved people and women, people who were disenfranchised under the law, to defend themselves in any kind of justifiable way against the folks who are holding them as either property or wives, right? And in those instances of retaliation, the law isn't on the side of those who aren't seen as persons. And so one of the great kind of concepts that I've been working with comes out of the work of Miriam Kaba and a lot of organizers who have been advocating for the self-defense, the right to self-defense of women and LGBTQ communities, is this slogan called "No Selves to Defend." And that idea of no self to defend might sound defeatist, like, oh, well, if you have no self to defend, isn't that just like a relinquishing of your power? No, in fact, it's a reclamation of it, because it's an articulation of, in the eyes of the law, there are huge populations of people who are seen as not human, who are seen as non-persons, who are seen as disposable. And the purpose of this kind of conversation is to shift the lens on that and understand from a different perspective what the implications of that disposability really are. And the implications of that disposability are being kind of revealed to us in real time, right? What happens when we protect perpetrators over survivors? We're seeing the effects of that. We saw that January 6th. We see that in the rise of fascism across the globe right now. We're seeing it in the predations of the police on communities of color. When we protect perpetrators in order to protect their reputation, that doesn't just have impacts for the immediate people involved in that intimate site of violence, right? It becomes an ideological structure that justifies the abuse of violence by those who hold power over those who do not, in terms of, you know, the environment, in terms of society. I mean, it's far reaching. And so in my classes, I tend to do this kind of like relay, as we're doing in this conversation already, which can be a little dizzying. The fact that we come back to the self and the body is probably what stabilizes it, right? But we have to have this ability to go in our consciousness from economies of scale that are intimate and interpersonal, and then systemic, and then do it again and again, because so many of the kind of false narratives that we rely on to think about criminal justice, to think about safety, to think about violence are scripts, right? And they've been handed down and passed off and repeated through television and social media, through the news and politics, so much that we forget what we're actually supposed to feel, right? In instances where all of a sudden we're faced with an instance of terror or violence, right? We reach for the thing that that we've been told will make us feel better. And what happens when we reach for it? It doesn't necessarily work. And
Right.
why doesn't it work? Because it doesn't actually get to the root cause of what's actually happening, right? And what's actually happening is so much bigger than anything any one person can solve themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why this kind of relay between the personal to the interpersonal to the systemic and then back again across time and space is so important to really understand what it is we're talking about. Because yes, we could focus on George Floyd, we could focus on spectacles of racism and violence, we could focus on the statistics of disproportional representation of Black men and young men and boys in prison. We can talk about the disproportional representation of women of color as like one of the largest, fastest increasing populations of women who are people who are incarcerated. But what those things don't tell us is what we're not even upset about yet, right? Is that we don't know what safety is actually, right? We live in a world where we think convenience is safe and where consumption is safe and should be protected over and against everything else. And so being able to really kind of bring in the big picture as we think about the big questions. Be a bit overwhelming, but I think it's actually going to solve a lot of the kind of dissolving of the nuance that we've been seeing in these kind of Black-white binary conversations about policing and prisons, in particular in our society today.
Yeah, one of the things that in what you said, that sort of notion of encountering kind of fear or terror or violence and not knowing how to respond, and so just kind of reacting in these sort of maybe scripted ways. I feel like just when you were saying that, one of the things that really kind of it brought to mind was actually COVID recently, where it was maybe the first time in recent memory where almost everybody was sort of faced with something that was unknown and fearful and potentially fatal to them, and did not. It was quite evident based on the sort of widespread social response to it that many of us, in fact, I would maybe say all of us, are not equipped to react to these sorts of moments. Like, we just don't know, where to begin in a sort of maybe healthy reaction to them.
It has been such a disappointment, I have to say. And, these are the spaces where we really start to see, my journey to a political theory of Black feminist political theory of critical carceral studies started. It started even further back, but it really started. I started out as a religious studies major.
Okay.
And so one of the things that I bring with me into this conversation are, theological conceptions that come from me from Paul Tillich about kind of what is our greatest concern, instead of thinking about God, divinity, just in the absolute, just in the theological, he wants to include atheists. So he thinks of he asks us to think about, well, what is your ultimate concern? And your ultimate concern really shapes your value system, your priorities, what time it is for you at any given time, right? And as we start to reflect on, everything that happened from kind of like March 2020 on, at least here in the United States, what we start to see is that our highest priority is not each other. Our highest concern is not life. Our highest concern is something else.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Avoiding fear, avoiding harm, material accumulation, I still have toilet paper and my items in my pantry that I should not eat because they are there from
Right.
money, right? And so I'm not trying to say like all you all are perpetrating all of it. I am implicated, right? This is the air we breathe. This is capital. This is carceral capitalism. Is that we believe that consumption will save us, when actually what created so much possibility was stillness,
Mhm.
was like resisting the need to travel, resisting the need to be busy and gather in ways that we had before. Now, of course, our virtual busyness
Right.
ballooned, but
Right.
one of the ways that I see COVID as the big teacher, the big mirror, the master teacher, is that it shows us what our cultural ultimate concern is, and that that is fiscal, and that it is not physical. And I
Yeah.
really can have so much concern, on a personal level for that, as someone who can't guarantee that even just a small exposure wouldn't lead to something quite dramatic for me, right?
Mhm.
So just in my own personal life and in my family, I'm sensitive to the impacts of long COVID and even the strains that are circulating now. But really what we're seeing is, again, the long-term impact on our reliance on preserving property over people.
Right.
That
Right.
it's accumulative, that it's not acute, it's not a spectacle. And so, one of the things that the prison industrial complex makes us overly occupied with are spectacles of violence. And spectacles of violence are horrifying, and I never ever want to experience them personally. And they're not the only forms of violence that happen in our society. So
Right.
much of what happens is like silent killers, right? And so when we see the kind of disproportionate exploitation of the global South, when we see the disproportionate exploitation of people of color and immigrant communities, undocumented communities, in forms of work that are completely depleted of dignity and
Mhm.
compensation, right? This is when we see the seedlings of the everyday violence that affects everyone, right? Because if there are people, we are only as strong as our weakest link. And if we are constructing weakness in our society, then we are compromising ourselves. And so being
Right.
able to really see that unfold in such hyperbolic ways through COVID has really enlightened me to the fact that, social consciousness raising probably insufficient to change the tide of these social ills. We really have to do more than just understand the concepts, really do more than just understand the analysis. We have to do more than just have the read, as we say in the movement, right? We actually have to move differently. And that really starts with ourselves. And so then again, we start from this like large catastrophic, systemic analysis and an awareness, consciousness raising. And then we have to see, well, how does that transform the way I move? Right? How does that transform the way that I deal with harm and conflict in myself? Right? How do I rake myself over? I don't know. My idioms are very hard for me. Something I inherited from my mom. I'm like, rake myself over the coals, rake myself over the. Why do I berate myself for things that are actually not my fault? Like,
Mhm.
what has justified that within me, right? And then how does that become a way of managing conflict interpersonally? And then how does that become a pattern of harm management, violence management in society, right? So once we start to see those concentric circles of kind of false diagnosis, right? Then we get to see why we haven't really shifted.
Right.
how, important it is to have an intellectual and academic understanding. But if we actually don't have a physical, interpersonal accountability process for learning how to move different in congregation, in community, as a flock of people, then we haven't heavily integrated what we know. And that's, to me, the next level of learning that we're all heading into in this next kind of iteration. I think that's what COVID has, given us the opportunity to practice with differently. Because as we know, COVID will not be the last of these
Right.
trials for us as a society.
Yeah. I want to kind of, we've been talking about things that in many respects are very dire, and very, large scale. But, we've been alluding to a little bit as well, but that, these are things are not sort of inevitable. There are possibilities for transformation. And I think to sort of focus in on, the prison industrial complex again, uh, there are scholars and activists out there who either label themselves or get labeled by, folks who are listening to them and studying them as either, kind of prison reformers or prison abolitionists. And I wonder if we could, just maybe walk through those kinds of positions a little bit, just so, we, when we, we're out there in the world and we're reading somebody, a commentator or a scholar or someone like that, we have a way of maybe situating them in one of these two, maybe somewhat arbitrary designations of prison reformers and prison abolitionists.
Absolutely. So what's so fun about this conversation is that it's been complicated for a couple hundred years.
Right.
And so when we walk into it, know that you're walking into a river that's been, a couple centuries old.
Right.
So one of the challenges of this conversation is that they are presented, reform and abolition, as opposites, as binaries, when in fact they're on a continuum, right? And in a lot of ways, they tell different stories about a orientation to change, really. A theory. They both have very different theories of change. So prison reform has been around as long as prisons have been around. Yeah. And, one of the largest kind of animating catalysts for prison reform over these 200 years have been the Quakers, right? Have been kind of Christian progressive communities who are trying to bring a little bit of accountability to systems of punishment. And so that looks very different depending on what era you're looking at, but beginning to understand that even within those reformist movements, there's quite a lot of division, schism, opposition, and paradox, right? And so there are some Quakers who were, animating the cause for anti-slavery abolition, who were interested in immediate, uncompensated end to this institution of slavery by any means necessary, right? But they were in the margin. They were like in the minority. The majority of Quakers wanted a nonviolent solution, incremental solution to slavery that would take time to realize, right? And being able to see those two conversations as oppositional, sure, on its face makes sense. But as you actually start to delve into the history of how these movements had an impact on the end of slavery, what you start to see is that both movements were necessary, right? That both movements do something different to the popular consciousness, to the common idea of the common good, that starts to shift our relationship and reliance on slavery over time. Meanwhile, right, those people who were living under direct impact of slavery, those folks who were living as enslaved human beings, were undermining the institution of slavery in everyday practices of sabotage, work slowdown, escape, truancy, and fugitivity, right? And so as the infrastructure of investment in the institution is being divested from by those who are most directly impacted, and as a critique of the institution is fomented, both the ones who say this is wrong and we need to change it slowly, or this is wrong and we need to change it immediately, all of those come together, right, to create a perfect storm of intolerance in the society for the institution itself. And so rather than think about what is the right analysis for my money, I'm interested in the perfect storm. And so as someone who really believes in abolition, one of the things that I've been really trying to work with, I call myself a practicing abolitionist. I got that like from my Dharma and activist friend, Aisha Shaida Simmons, who brings her Dharma practice into a world of activism to end child sexual abuse and violence. Right. And so one of the things that she says is that, we're not always up for abolition. We might not always have the for it in the given moment because we've been so habituated to vigilante violence or retributive violence. The idea that people must pay for wrongs that have been done to us. So we're unlearning that as a cultural society, because we're seeing the impacts of where it goes, right? So as a practicing abolitionist, I'm trying to imagine a world in which we are no longer policing people around the right messaging, the right words, right? Even in the kind of, political correctness of the 90s that I grew up with, is a kind of outlier of policing itself, right? As like cancel culture is part of an outlier of policing itself. And so I would like to live in a world where we can have a conversation instead of calling 911. And being able to have that, like, it's amazing the kinds of infrastructure that would be necessary for us to have a conversation instead of calling the police. And for me, calling the police isn't just, the physical police department, but it's calling on whatever authority trumps the authority of those with whom you are engaged in a dispute, right? How come we can't just talk to each other? And now in some instances, it's impossible because people aren't ready to listen. But what are the conditions of possibility that would make us have the strength of will, conviction, and skill to be able to hold space for those kinds of very challenging conversations without just resorting to brute violence, right? Or having to have people restrain us with brute violence, which is really what it comes down to when we're talking about reliance on the prisons and policing to keep us safe, is that we're relying on violence to protect us from violence, right? And I think the evolution is not just about prison reform, not just about prison abolition even, but is about reimagining what justice looks like in our society and how we hold each other accountable. And if punishment, violence is the only way we know how to hold each other accountable, then guess what? People aren't going to change. They're just going to continue to bypass accountability by whatever means necessary. And this is what we're seeing at the highest levels of society. And so for my money, like, these distinctions between reform and abolition become irrelevant when we're really thinking about the big picture. But for those who are really, really wanting to understand the distinctions, largely reform is has many faces, right? And so I often turn to Black feminists in the movement who have been focusing on the distinction between reformist reform and abolitionist reform. Reformist reform being those reforms that actually don't change our reliance on prisons and policing to keep us safe. They maybe just mitigate and sanitize the spectacles of violence that these institutions rely on in order to do their jobs, right? Nicer, kinder, gentler forms of punishment, right? But abolitionist reforms actually curtail the expansion, the life force of carceral power itself, carceral culture itself. And so being able to discern what counts as what is an ongoing conversation within social movements and within academic communities, of course, in policy communities. For me, the distinction becomes a bit of a misnomer, a red herring.
Okay.
And so I encourage people to really think about our reliance on violence to keep us safe. And if it is what makes us feel most at home in the places we call home. And if it creates discomfort for others, while it creates a false security for us. And if all of those things are true, then we need to imagine differently and move differently. And those shifts are not going to be silver bullet or instantaneous or spectacular. Right. They're going to take practice and error, like it's science. Like this is what we have to apply the skills of scientific methodology that we have so much skillfulness in so many areas. We can go to the moon, but we can't stop people from hurting each other unnecessarily, right? And so being able to see the interpersonal as the next frontier, interpersonal safety, personal safety as the next frontier of discovery in terms of how we change, how we know what we know about freedom, safety, and democracy. These are the new kind of horizons for us. Is the the horizon of the intimate life, our intimate lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe as a way of sort of capping things off here in our conversation, we might just sort of think a little bit about what what a society might look like if prison abolition is sort of accomplished. I think that's often the question that many people have when they're first encountering prison abolition as a concept is like, it doesn't quite compute with them because they think that we need a place to put all the bad people, right?
Right.
So yeah, I wonder how, what are some of maybe the models that people have kind of developed for, thinking about abolishing prisons?
So I am so animated by this question. I think it's one of the most critical questions, and it comes up in every conversation that I have about prison abolition. And what it reflects back to me is how effective our carceral culture is in feeding our fear of each other. One of the things that I notice in moments of like mass crisis, 9/11, the beginning days of COVID, the aftermath of the George Floyd viral representation of state-sanctioned murder, is that people come together, right? Even in cases of personal tragedy, right? We see people come forward and come together in ways that they wouldn't otherwise, right? Overcoming petty animosities in order to, meet together for a common good. It doesn't always happen. And yet, we've seen it happen in places like New York City. We've seen it happen again and again. And so fostering and supporting our capacity and skill to return to that practice is going to be huge in expanding our imagination of what a world without prisons would look like and would require. Kind of in the abstract, I can just say that our focus on individualism in this culture, in our Western culture, is a huge hindrance to prison abolition. So long as I'm prioritizing me and mine over anyone else's,
Right.
the likelihood is that I'm going to want walls. The likelihood is that I'm going to want guns. The likelihood is that I'm going to be living in a fear of you crossing over into my bounded territory, right? But our relationship to safety need not be bounded in this way. Plenty of societies before this one operated quite differently, right? And the idea of property being territorialized is a very modern idea. And so being able to evolve our orientation to home is really what I see as the kind of seedling of a next iteration of society. And this doesn't necessarily mean, a relationship to communism as we've heard it, but I really do think it has to do with communalism. I'm a church kid. My dad's a preacher. I spent my whole life in the church until I rebelled and found my cushion in my meditation practice, but because that's just been my journey. But for me, the congregation experience in whatever religious tradition I've been in has been incredibly powerful for me to really begin to imagine differently what collective accountability for harm looks like, right? Because in a congregation, when someone is suffering, the community comes together. When someone is harmed or experiencing violence or perpetuating violence, the community comes together, right? So it actually doesn't matter who's at fault. It's a collective accountability issue, right? So whether it's a scarcity of resources, right, or a preponderance of antisocial behavior, the idea that the community holds it and has to shift in order to contend and heal from it is a really different orientation to health and wholeness, right? As opposed to one that says, if you want to be well, you better work real hard and make sure that you do it yourself. This idea
Right.
of self-reliance really makes it seem like, I don't need help. And also, you are on your own with that, right? So I'm starting to see how in the spaces of congregation that come to us, passed down to us through cultures of institutionalized religion, we see kind of the blueprints, we can see kind of the frameworks for alternative forms of social accountability that absolutely have been dragged through capitalism and colonialism, so they're not untainted. I'm just trying to give us a container for thinking about it non-hierarchically, to think about it in terms of collective accountability. So for me, instead of thinking about social change as something's going to come into society that doesn't exist yet, I'm actually thinking about it more in this way, that there are practices in our society that we already have under our belts, but we just don't think of as scalable in the same way as we think of privacy as scalable, right? So we've really put privacy in a place of ultimate concern in our culture. And I wonder if interdependence were part of our ultimate concern, how that would change our relationality, how that would change our embodiment, how that would change our interpersonal reaction to things like harm and violence, how it would change our personal relationship to the ways in which we harm ourselves and participate in violence in our own lives, right? So if there were a sense of interdependence, right, my relationship to, say, addiction or being a survivor of sexual violence would no longer be about shame and privacy and like cloistering, would be about like truth telling and witness and being seen and being supported, and like not having that experience be one that further like contracts my sense of self, but one that expands my sense of interconnectedness to not only people, but animals and land and earth and resources, right? Because at the end of the day, this modern society, and we could, have a whole dissertation, Odysseus and, fast forwarding through like Adorno and Horkheimer to think about the ways that modern culture is isolating.
Mhm.
Modern culture is isolating in ways that several modern theorists before me have talked about alienation, right? And so being able to see how that vortex of isolation, alienation can be undone by just recognizing that we need each other to survive, and that we
Right.
need better protocols of relationality for thinking about safety and accountability when we're not surviving well. Other protocols than self-reliance, other protocols than punishment and isolation and disposability, right? Those are the things that we are proficient at. But interdependence, care, knowing how to ask for help in ways that aren't about demand and domination or guilt or shame, these are the things that we actually have very little practice in. And so, I'm here for doing this from the level of preschool on up. I'm here for doing this like in the streets and on the corner with my homies, all the way to, in the academy, to doing it in spaces of government, and thinking about it as these are the things that are going to be scalable, right? Is that we have to have a whole different relationship to homemaking. Because when our relationship to homemaking is based on fear of others trespassing versus a desire for mutual thriving with our neighbors of all species, until we have that kind of shift, there's no way, right? And so I'm here for the kind of like microbial changes, as well as the protests in the streets, as well as the big policy changes. And so in that way, I really do love being able to move from the intimate to the institutional to the ideological in one breath, because it's in that relay that we're able to find clarity. I think when we get fixated on one level of consciousness, one level of subjectivity, one level of being, we forget about the others really quickly. And so it's actually the return to each that is instructive. And so being able to think about a world without prisons on multiple levels, the spiritual, the intellectual, the economic, the international, these are the ways that we need to be moving and relating to the issues and educating ourselves, not just about the history and not just about the landscape, but also about the kind of theory of change that we rely on to create the world that we want to see.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to wrap up that sort of message of, thinking about interdependence on, multiple levels, and sort of maybe hoping to train ourselves to do that work more thoroughly. So I want to thank you very much, Jasmine, for joining us. This has been really great, really instructive and enlightening, and inspiring in many ways.
Thank you so much for the questions. This conversation is so timely. I'm really excited to be able to be educating in this way. And that there are so many ways to engage with these issues, and particularly ones that focus more on policies and statistics. And I really wanted the opportunity to bring something new to the conversation. So I'm hoping that the kind of more effective emotional life of critical prison studies is helpful to people.
I'm sure it will be. Yeah. Thanks. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much too. It's been a lovely day.